Hello everyone and welcome to Transform Pod. Today you're with your co-host Heather and we are going to talk about love, fear and everything in between. So in today's episode we're going to dive into a topic that a lot of us have experienced or currently experiencing, and this is the anxious attachment. We're going to break down what it is, why it happens and how it affects our relationships, and most importantly how we can start to manage and heal from it. So to start, let's define what an anxious attachment is. So it's one of the four main attachment styles and it stems from our early childhood experiences. In attachment theory, the idea is that the way our caregivers responded to us as children affects the way we form bonds in adulthood. For people with anxious attachment style, the caregivers were likely inconsistent. Sometimes they were emotionally available, but at other times they might have been distant, preoccupied or unavailable. And this inconsistency leaves the child unsure of what to expect, and that uncertainty can become internalized. They learn that love isn't always reliable and they feel like they have to work harder to get attention, affection or approval. As adults, people with anxious attachment often crave closeness, but simultaneously fear that they'll lose it. So this makes relationships feel like a constant balancing act. They often feel insecure, need frequent reassurance, and may worry that their partner or loved ones don't care as much as they do. So now I want you to have a think about your own relationships. Have you ever felt like you were overthinking every little thing your partner did or didn't do? Maybe you've texted them and they haven't texted back right away and you started spiraling into thoughts like, are they upset with me? Did I do something wrong? Are they with somebody else? If so, you might be familiar with anxious attachment. But here's some key points. Anxious attachment is not a personal flaw. It's not about being too much or too needy. It's a learned pattern based on early experiences, and this is something we can work on. So how does an anxious attachment actually show up in our relationships? So let's talk about a few common behaviours that you might recognise. First, there's a constant need for reassurance. People with anxious attachment often feel like they need to hear that everything is okay, whether it's in the form of I love you or I'm not mad at you. Without this reassurance, it's easy to fall into a spiral of doubt and anxiety. You might find yourself asking questions like, are we still okay? Or do you still love me? Even when nothing seems wrong, this can become exhausting, not just for you, but for your partner as well. Another common behaviour is a heightened sensitivity to any perceived threat to the relationship. This might mean that if your partner seems distant for a day, doesn't reply to a text right away or seems distracted, it can feel like a big deal. So even small things like a change in tone or a missed call might make you feel like the relationship is at risk. There's also something called protest behaviour. So this happens when people with an anxious attachment act out in ways to get their partner's attention or to re-establish closeness. So you might withdraw emotionally, get clingy or even pick a fight just to feel that connection again. The problem is protest behaviours often backfire. So instead of bringing you closer to your partner, they create more distance, which then fuels the anxiety even more. So if this sounds familiar and you can relate to these patterns, you're not alone. These behaviours come from a place of fear, and it's the fear of losing love or being abandoned. So let's talk about the emotional experience of having an anxious attachment style. For many people, it feels like being on a roller coaster. The highs and the lows where you feel connected and reassured and close to your partner, and the lows are when you feel distant, anxious or insecure. These emotional swings can be really intense. So for example, say your partner is really attentive one day and they're texting you a lot, showing you affection, everything feels great, but then the next day they're a bit more withdrawn or they don't seem as engaged as they were the day before. That sudden shift can trigger a lot of anxiety, making you feel like there's something wrong even when nothing is. So the ups and downs can make it hard to feel stable in the relationship. When you're on a high, everything feels wonderful, but when you're on a low, it can feel like the relationship is on sort of shaky ground. Now, this emotional roller coaster can make it difficult to trust in the relationship, and it can create a constant state of worry, wondering, do they still care? What if the leave is? What if I'm not enough? And if you felt this way, it's important to recognise that the fear isn't necessarily based on reality. It's based on past experiences and emotional patterns. but it feels very real in the moment, and that's what makes anxious attachment so challenging. So if we take a step back and talk about why anxious attachment happens in the first place, as I mentioned earlier, attachment styles are formed in early childhood. If you grew up in an environment where love and affection were inconsistent, or if you had a caregiver who was emotionally unavailable or unpredictable, you likely developed an anxious attachment style. And this isn't about blaming our parents or our caregivers, it's about understanding the patterns that they were set in motion early on. So in some cases, people with anxious attachment may have had caregivers who were physically present but emotionally distant. Maybe your parents were busy, stressed, or unable to provide the kind of emotional support that you needed. Or maybe they were affectionate sometimes but cold and unavailable at other times. And these mixed signals can create a sense of uncertainty that carries out into adulthood. Now, what's important to realise is that these early experiences create a kind of blueprint for how we approach relationships later in life. So if you learn that love is unpredictable, or that you have to work hard to get attention, it makes sense that you might carry those same fears into your adult relationships. So what can we do if you would identify with an anxious attachment style? So the good news is that change is possible. You're not stuck with the attachment style forever, and there are steps you can take to move toward a more secure attachment. Now, the first step is awareness. Simply recognizing that you have an anxious attachment style can be a huge relief. It helps you understand why you feel the way you do in relationships and why you behave in certain ways. And the second step is to challenge the thoughts and fears that come up when you find yourself spiraling and worrying. What if they don't care about me anymore? Or pause and ask yourself, is this thought based on evidence, or is it based on fear? And often you'll realise that your fears aren't grounded in reality, but in your own anxiety. So, if your partner was really attentive, like every day, and then one day, they weren't sort of as present, there's not a lot of evidence to say that they don't care about you and things anymore, because people have busy lives. So if you look at the evidence, it can help you sort of ground yourself in that reality. And another important tool is self-soothing. So when you feel anxious, practice calming yourself down instead of relying solely on your partner for reassurance, because this could be through deep breathing, journaling, or reminding yourself of your own worth. It's really important to recognise your own self-worth, and that, because an anxious attacher can often be really dependent on their partner, overly dependent, and give up a lot of their life solely for the relationship. So having your own self-worth and your own things to do, your own friendships and things like that, is really going to help with that anxious attachment style. And communication is really key. So if you're in a relationship, talk to your partner about how you're feeling. Let them know that you need, reassurance, but also recognise that it's not their job to constantly manage your anxiety, because healthy relationships are built on understanding and not codependency. And if you are really codependent on your partner, the likelihood is you are going to push them away, because they can become really, really overwhelmed with what is needed and expected of them in terms of that. Now, before I wrap this up, I want to emphasise that the anxious attachment isn't a life sentence. It is a pattern that you can change with time, patience, and self-awareness. By recognising your attachment style and challenging your fears and working on self-soothing, you can start to create healthier, more secure relationships. Now, if you go on our website at Transformed Life Coaching, we do have free resources available on there and purchasable ones. We're also on TikTok and Instagram. We'll have the links on the bio for that, and they are also Transformed Life Coaching. Now, I hope today's episode has given you some clarity and practical tools to start working on your anxious attachment. But remember, the journey towards a secure attachment is a process. It won't happen overnight, but every small step counts, so you will start to learn to identify your triggers a lot sooner, and over time they will become easier. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have enjoyed the episode, it'd be great if you could follow us so we can bring you more content like this. Thank you. Bye.